Good morning. I'm Margaret Palmer. I'm director of SESYNC, the National Socio-Environmental Synthesis Center, and I'm really happy to see all of you that are here, as well as those who are joining us remotely. As you know, to accelerate research, NSF announced a new opportunity to support the development of international network-to-network collaborations. To enhance community preparedness for this, NSF has organized a number of activities, some of which have already occurred. They held a webinar to introduce the new opportunity, a workshop on stakeholder engagement, and they funded a workshop using the so-called toolbox to focus on team science. Today's workshop is focused broadly on what it takes to make a research network successful. And obviously a research network is a form of an organization. We have a number of accomplished speakers who will talk to us throughout the day and a half. And the topics will include things like examples and models of networks and how they came about, processes that can be used to identify the goals of a particular network and to reach agreement among the members of that network, the difficulties that are associated with dispersed collaborations, which many of you may be aware of already, but importantly, how to overcome these and what some of the strategies are, and especially the importance of communication. There'll also be a discussion of team science, the fundamentals of that, and why that's an important, the principles of that are important to consider when forming an organization like this. Discussions of setting expectations and evaluations will come up, and then important issues of data sharing and data management. I wanted to begin with just emphasizing that there is extensive research already showing that research excellence depends not only on having great researchers and all the skills you need for a particular problem, but on the conditions of the research environment. The structure of the organization, the kinds of processes that are employed, the team culture and engagement climate, and particularly the leadership, which is extremely important. Not necessarily to be a figurehead, but to be a very active participant that oversees a very transparent process and pays attention to team dynamics. What I thought I would do is to provide some examples of these attributes and some of the things, or these activities, and some of the things that I mentioned in my opening by telling you a little bit about SESYNC and how we formed. Now, the reason this is relevant is that SESYNC actually has many of the attributes in common with a network of networks. All of the work that SESYNC has supported is team-based, and much of the interaction among those teams is done remotely, not here necessarily at the center. Additionally, we're international in scope, and this is both in terms of the participants that are involved in our networks, and I would say we have about 40 different networks currently. We've had more than that historically. Highly international, and then the questions that they focus on are also very international in scope. Obviously, they're related to our particular center theme, which is environmental and social dynamics associated with that. And these are just a few examples of some of our networks that have focused on urban biodiversity, impacts of narco-trafficking on land use and land cover, and global wildlife trade and disease risks. The organizational theory that we used at SESYNC, and it's really important to think about this as you begin designing a network, is that first we worked together among the leadership team to co-develop what our vision was and what our goals were. And these were very explicit, clearly stated, and you'll see as I move on, were used to guide how we developed the way the center would run. The next step we took on, and this is just our particular organizational process, developmental process, was to identify what we thought the key challenges were associated with forming an effective center focused on, in our case, socio-environmental problems. And those went beyond just the process topics that I talked about a few minutes ago. And depending on what the network is that you're interested in forming, you will also have challenges that go beyond just the organizational ones. We then use those challenges that we identified to develop and design a number of processes and our organizational structure, including our staffing, that would help to overcome those specific challenges. And I'll emphasize a bit later that in particular, we used a highly adaptive developmental process with rapid evaluation, self-evaluation, and center evaluation, not external but internal, to change our processes until we had settled on one that we thought was very effective. And for this reason, we've often talked about the center as experiment is how we formed. The processes and structures that we developed included, as I mentioned, not only the types of positions and the programs, but also a set of processes which are summarized here. It's not important for you to read these specifics because this is specific to SESYNC, but a set of things we would do to help accelerate teamwork. Now remember, in our case, each of the teams we support is a form of a network, although it may be smaller than the networks that you're focused on. Ours range in size from 9 to maybe 25 or 30 individuals around the globe. The important thing is we thought deeply about how we could make those networks successful, and that involved active types of things with teams, and it involved things that we could do distantly. It even involved things that the teams weren't aware we were doing in the background. Some of the lessons we learned, first, that the leadership should be involved very actively in recruitment. That is, to the extent you can, instead of just opening the doors to everyone, really identify the kinds of people that are critical to your network. Also pay attention to the extent to which they have collaborative skills. They're collaborative ready. For most of you, if you've done collaborative work, you know that, one bad apple can really cause problems. And so you do want to focus on those sorts of things. It's really important to seek diversity across a lot of dimensions. There are a number of research studies that have shown diversity accelerates innovation, and that can be along a variety of dimensions, including not only ethnic diversity, but diversity in disciplines, diversity in methods and perspectives. It's also critical that in building the team originally, that the stakeholders involved, and I'll revisit this issue of stakeholders again, but they should have input in terms of the kinds of people or individuals you want to recruit to the network. Now, in terms of sustaining teams, which is particularly a problem when you are working remotely, it is essential to have at least one face-to-face meeting, hopefully early on if possible. Forming some sort of social bond, even if it is simply getting to know someone, who they are, where they're from, can make a huge difference. Social interactions are critical at that point in time, but they don't have to end when you're working remotely. There are ways to do things and again, this is where the leadership plays a critical role in ensuring this happens, that there's some levity in discussions, that there's a sense of connectivity that goes beyond just getting information and sharing data. Communication, you're going to hear about it all day long. The one thing I'll say about it, other than just it's important, is that we found that choosing the simplest communication platform was the best. I had this naive idea when we opened 8+ years ago that things had advanced so much. We were going to have the perfect remote connectivity and people would interact easily. No, people get dropped. People don't understand how to get on. The simpler you can make that, and being willing to change if the group really works better in another format. So we developed our own way to communicate electronically among teams. Turns out they didn't want to do that. Most teams wanted to use a Google platform. So you just have to be flexible and change and do what works. One thing that has come from research as well, and I learned this from reading Steve Fior's book, if any of you are familiar with him, is that recognizing each individual's contribution to the team is actually really important, and it's important to do that repeatedly. Now, by that, I don't mean saying, oh, thank you, Mary, your role as the data something is so important. What I mean is devising ways to ensure that all members of the team know who's doing what and why they're critical to the team. And this can be simply in the form of those different individuals reporting out repeatedly, or again, the leader trying to pull different people in to clarify that. Accountability is also important. So while each individual should have a role in the network, they also should be accountable for that. And so, for example, one of the ways we do that at SESYNC is we actually require meeting with the teams or the individual networks remotely, periodically, to ask them to update us on what's going on. And this actually keeps them on schedule. It's not that different from reminding your kids you have homework. But when they have to give some sort of a formal presentation or present to the group repeatedly about their progress on what they are responsible for, it actually makes a difference. It's important to have early on some rules that the group sets up. And the kinds of rules that you want to set up vary depending on your goals. In our case, one of the most common things is often becomes issues of authorship on publications. And so we really encourage our teams to make that decision early on. What constitutes authorship? It's much better to do that before you get to a point where there's something being written and there's a question about who is an author. But there are also other forms of other things that should be talked about, rules of engagement, not putting other people down, et cetera, et cetera. These kinds of things should be talked about. There also should be an individual who is responsible for doing all these things above. I can't emphasize enough, somebody has to be responsible for that and has to make sure it always happens, or else it tends to get left by the wayside. I think many of you are aware that NSF has been focusing on encouraging convergence research. There are lots of different words you could use to describe what convergence means. We had been using the word actionable. It simply means that it is a problem that the team or a network is focused on that has societal relevance. And it typically is one that requires more than one discipline and a group working together on that topic, particularly with those who care about the outcome of the research. And by that I mean stakeholders is the common word. I often had trouble with that word because to me that meant perhaps, for example, the fishing industry, if you were focusing on a project related to fisheries. It could be that, but it also could be something broader because we tend to fund at SESYNC what we call actionable but fundamental. That means our projects that we fund, our networks, are focused on topics that could be relevant in another place or point in time. So often our stakeholders are much broader. They may be policymakers, they may be representatives from a non-governmental organization, since we don't push to make something happen that's related to a policy, but we try and accelerate research that could help inform decisions and inform policies. It's important for us to be involved with those who care about the outcome of the research. And often you hear a discussion of the importance of value propositions, and it's important to make those early on. And what that means is to really explicitly understand what it is your stakeholders, in whatever form they are, what kinds of benefits they expect that you hope you can deliver from that. The effectiveness of interdisciplinary collaborations is also something that SESYNC had to focus on. And so I'll just mention some of the lessons learned. What you see here in the last slide, I showed that about 25 members of each of our networks is what we call a stakeholder or a potential knowledge user. Sometimes we say that. This shows the academic composition of our networks. And you see in our case, they're highly diverse. It depends on what your network is focused on. And so we think it's essential in many teams to start out with a focus on epistemological issues. That doesn't mean you walk in the room and say, okay, let's talk about epistemological issues. It means you design an activity that actually elicits some of that tacit knowledge people bring to the room, which can really influence, and their views and backgrounds, which can greatly influence what they say in their input. And if it is actually recognized openly, things can run more smoothly. An example of an activity that I've seen Jonathan Kramer, who's our lead facilitator here, do with a team is to have each member of, in your case it might be a network, at the very first meeting, either write down or draw an image of what they think would represent a conceptual model of the problem and the way it could be solved. Then the group, one by one, individuals share those conceptual models with the rest of the group. And what that does is it helps to bring out that tacit knowledge. So for example, I often talk about, let's say you have a network focused on water security, and you have diverse members of that network. Well, myself, as a biophysical scientist, I might immediately start focusing on soil quality, water availability, increased production. Well, a social scientist in that network may immediately start talking about vulnerability, access to food. That can fundamentally change the dialogue or the direction that that project may go once you recognize that there are many more dimensions of that, which actually are often focusing on both become far more interesting. Conflicts, not necessarily out-and-out fights, but conflicts are extremely common. They can be very productive in networks if they're managed well and they're not just avoided and pushed under the table. Here's where the leader can play an important role in looking for those and ensure that they're not just set aside, but that they're addressed. And again, they can be healthy and sometimes lead to more positive outcomes intellectually. Facilitators can be useful at different stages. It depends on the team if they're open to this and if it's something that they could benefit from. We use them at SESYNC fairly often. One of the mistakes we see most often that my colleague Jonathan has pointed out so frequently to me is teams have a tendency, if they're highly interdisciplinary, to quickly split up by discipline into subteams. Okay, well, we'll go off in this room and we're going to put this together because you need it and this and this and this. That's a big mistake. It's really important to stay together from the beginning. What tends to happen is you may get a lot of papers that are interesting but mostly disciplinary, but the really interesting work, which is at the intersection, rarely gets done when it's approached in that fashion. So you want to be careful about that. And I want to close with just talking briefly about training the next generation and what we do at SESYNC. So there's lots of different ways to have a big impact in terms of the next generation of scientists. In our case, we focus primarily on our postdoctoral program. However, I should say we have ramped up a major graduate program in the last 5 or 6 years. What's interesting about our postdoc program is that I would say it's two-pronged. So part of it is a focus on their science and their science project, and that's critical. That's what we're all here for, is to advance research. But a big part of it also that we've put in place here is what we call our immersion program. And the goal of that is to really build not just professional skills, but the kinds of skills that will enhance ability to engage in interdisciplinary work. And in our case, because our interdisciplinary work is around socio-environmental systems, we think it's essential for the postdocs to learn enough about the core disciplines that are typically brought in to solve socio-environmental problems, that they even know that they might want to collaborate with a person from that discipline. And often this means things like learning a little about how different disciplines, the theoretical lens through which they approach questions, the kinds of methods they use. So for example, we may have a postdoc who's a climate modeler, and they have no idea that ethnographic research can be highly quantitative in the way it can be used, what it actually means to do that. We had, in our first year of immersion workshops, and the way we run these is we invite some of the top scholars in from the discipline we're going to focus on, and sometimes rather than a discipline, it's a topic. And we ask those scholars to talk about, again, the theoretical lens and the methods they use, not to talk about their own research other than to use it as examples. And they lead sort of interactive discussions with the postdocs. From that, I heard postdocs, many of them come out and say from one of the workshops, I didn't know I need to work with anthropologists. That's who I need to be working with. That's just the way we do it, highly interactive. We do other things. We call this program dispositional learning, and the idea is to learn by doing rather than just being lectured at. So we have workshops where they actively practice team science skills. We also encourage them to participate. We have typically 20 postdocs in residence here, but we encourage them to participate in one of the networks that we fund that mostly works remotely. And then we involve them as a panelist for peer review and so forth. So the point is they're doing research, but they're also being trained up in a different way to try and undertake the kind of work you're trying to do at this point more effectively. So thank you very much. At this point, I will turn the podium over to my colleague, Dr. Carrie Ritz.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to just do a little bit of logistics for the participants in the room, and then we're going to go into participant introductions. So the all-important logistics are that the restrooms are outside of the center, women's to the left, men's to the right by Merrill Lynch. We're going to have breaks at 10:30 and 3:30, and lunch from 12:30 to 1:30. During this time, the live stream will be paused, so people who are tuning in on live stream, there will be a pause at that point. Each participant in the room got a packet when they sat down. There's some reimbursement information in there, speaker biographies, a copy of the NIH Team Science Field Guide that one of our speakers, Dr. Marchand, provided for all of us. The edited live stream recordings and PowerPoint copies will be posted on our website shortly after the workshop has ended. We need to edit things, finalize them, and then they'll be available. And I just want to talk a little bit about the purpose and the goals of this particular workshop, kind of following on Margaret's introduction. So the overall goal of this workshop is to introduce self-identified potential network of network PIs and participants to the science of team science, particularly as relevant to remote communication and dispersed networks. Our speakers will cover a range of topics and examples, such as effective network communication, participant engagement, network leadership, and management techniques. These topics have been identified, as Margaret indicated, in a growing body of literature around the science of team science, organizational management, and effective transdisciplinary research collaborations as key themes, challenges, and opportunities that transcend disciplines. We hope that participants will leave with an enhanced understanding of the critical role played by different leadership styles, transferable techniques to develop organizational and communication strategies, methods to establish a shared vision and network of network goals, insights into data sharing agreements and management, and the vital role that multi-level flexibility and adaptation play as networks evolve and change through time. So that just kind of gives you an introduction of what we're hoping to achieve through our invited speakers. I think the last piece that I wanted to convey is that in terms of the agenda and flow, we'll have speakers talk followed by 15 to 20 minutes of in-person questions, and then 15 to 20 minutes of remote questions. So if you're participating remotely, you can submit your questions on our YouTube chat at any time, and we will feed them up for that part of the session and try to get to as many as we can within the time constraints that we have at the end of all the talks, or at the end of that talk. Okay, those are sort of the logistics so that we can move forward. I thought this would be a good time for us to figure out who we are in the room. So we're going to kind of go around and do participant introductions. And I'd like each participant to take a few moments to give us your name, your title, your affiliation, and why you're interested in the workshop. Now, we only have a short period of time for this, so please try to be as brief as possible. And we'll just start right here with Selena Connolly.
Hi, I'm Selena Keneally, and I work at New Mexico EPSCoR as the Education and Outreach Manager. I'm pleased to be here with you all today, and I'll pass this along.
Steve Uzo, New York Hall of Science. I'm the Chief Scientist.
Catherine Kramer, and I'm very happy to be here. I am the founder of a brand new entity, and so this is a great opportunity to learn from you all. It's called the Woods Hole Institute. Happy to tell you more about our mission. And I'm also on the board of the Network Science Society. I've been interested in studying networks, particularly growing network of people interested in network science education. And we have published a brochure on that, and happy to talk more about that as well in the future, and looking forward to it.
My name is Tim Spuck. I'm the Director of Education and Public Engagement for Associated Universities Incorporated. My interest in being here is to learn from all of you. Hearing the first presentation, my question was, where were you 3 years ago? Because I'm thinking about projects that I've been, currently PI on that are building networks or building communities. And so just trying to figure out how I can be more efficient and how I can share what I've learned, both the successes and the failures of my experiences.
Hi, I'm Claire Hemingway, and I'm the program director that's managing the new AccelNet program, and that's short for Accelerating Research Through International Network-to-Network Collaborations.
Steve Sawyer, sitting in the middle, so I'm spinning around. Syracuse University, I study work, and most of the past decade is studying the work of researchers. So thanks for helping.
Hi, I'm Lauren Buck. I'm at Northern Arizona University, Professor of Biological Sciences. I also have an appointment at the University of Sao Paulo, so I spend a lot of time doing international work back and forth. I'm also PI on a research coordination network funded by the National Science Foundation.
Good morning. My name is Marissa Rinkus. I'm a research associate with the Center for Interdisciplinarity and the Toolbox Dialogue Initiative, which Margaret mentioned earlier. And so we do help facilitate those epistemological conversations that you would like to have. And we're working with NSF to provide the PI's workshops, the current AccelNet PI's workshops in the end of October. So I'm here to learn how we can better support researchers for networks to networks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Ariane de Bremond. I'm the Executive Officer of the Global Land Program, which is one of the global research projects of the Future Earth Global Change Research Initiative. I'm also a senior scientist at the University of Bern at the Center for Development and Environment in Switzerland, where the International Program Office is based, but I am faculty at the University of Maryland College Park in Geographical Sciences. And I'm PI on a NASA-funded socio-environmental synthesis of large-scale land acquisitions. But I'm particularly interested in this program because as a network within a broader network that's looking to sort of stretch the network dimensions from the traditional sort of geosciences and within the sciences to much more sort of TD-based approaches, looking at the Sustainable Development Goals and looking at how different kinds of actors can be incorporated into new network structures. And we have so much to learn on that and so much to do. And I wanted to come for all those reasons.
Hi, I'm Jay Jones. I'm an ecosystem ecologist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks. I'm a PI on a research coordination network focused on stream ecosystems, and I'm interested in how we can connect to other networks and expand what we're doing.
Morning, everyone. Eduardo Santillan. I am based at the University of Kentucky, and I'm affiliated with a number of networks, including EPSCoR and LSAMP, and more recently, an NSF research traineeship program. And all of this includes a considerable amount of team science and also, well, networking and networking between networks. And thus, here I am.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Pamela Collins. I'm a scientist at Conservation International and their Moore Center for Science. In a past life, I very briefly studied startup culture and dynamics, and it's really cool to see a lot of the similarities between what you guys are all outlining here and that body of knowledge, so awesome. My portfolio at Conservation International focuses on the linkages between conservation and sustainable development within the SDG context. I have a particular focus on water-related issues, and my portfolio is already highly networked. A lot of our collaborations are international across sectors, across every boundary you can think of, we break it. So that's an awesome thing about being at an NGO. My goals for being here are to continue to build on my knowledge in every dimension you can imagine, to build my own network by getting to know all of you, and then also to learn a little bit more about the ExcelNet opportunity, because I hear that's relatively new. I'd love to get a better sense for what that entails. So.
Hello, my name's Stuart Davies. I'm at the Smithsonian Institution, and I run a global network on forest ecology, tropical and temperate. We're in 27 countries now, and I'm very interested in learning and developing how we can network among other groups who are doing forest science at a global scale. So,
hello everyone, my name is Wilfrido Moreno. I'm a professor in the Department of Electrical Engineering at the University of South Florida, Tampa, Florida. And presently I serve as the Director of Research and Development for a consortium, it's called ISTEC, the Ibero-American Science and Technology Consortium, that we have more than 100 universities in Latin America, Spain and Portugal. And our main focus has been improving engineering education. And in the last 5 years, we've been creating networks in the area of research and collaboration among the faculty members within these universities. Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Igor Alvarado. I'm from National Instruments, so I come from industry. I have also worked with Willie on the ISTEC initiative in Latin America, but we also participate directly on several consortia. One of them, for example, is the NSF Power Consortia for wireless communications and 5G. So my role in the company and National Instruments is to develop collaborations with universities. I actually the academic research manager, which is a very unique position on the industry side. So I try just to help to connect, universities, researchers, and industry to solve some of the big challenges that we have in technology and related topics.
I'm Linda Kinkle. I'm at the University of Minnesota. I'm leading the NSF-funded Agricultural Microbiomes, RCN, and what's struck us, what's really blindsided me, is the extent to which activities in this area internationally are enormous. We've been approached by, I'm on the European Microbiome Initiative now, the Australian, the Southeast Asian, the South American, and the reality is this can't all interface through one or two people. We need to much more effectively find a way to work together, and I hope to learn those things here. I have to also say one thing I've been trying to really work deliberately with. I've got a set of 4 postdocs in our lab, and as I just reviewed tenure packages this fall, some of you might note, when I started, you went up for tenure with papers with 1, 2, maybe 3 authors. And every tenure package that I've seen, those students or those faculty are coming forward with papers with 6, 8, 11, 14 authors. You collaborate to be productive today. It's a different world. And I look at these 4 young postdocs and I'm asking myself, how can I help them learn how to be a strategic and effective collaborator? And I'm already super excited about what I'm going to be able to bring back from this conference to help train our next generation of scientists to be much more effective than we've been, or than I've been stumbling in the dark.
Thank you. My name is Gil Nelson. I am the lead PI on integrated digitized biocollections, IDIG Bio, which is an NSF project under the Advancing Digitization of Biodiversity Collections program. I'm also the full-time project director, more than full-time project director. And you guys have all been so succinct, it leaves me a lot of time. So get ready. So we are a project that includes at this point projects in every state and one or two territories. We currently have a database of biodiversity specimen data that totals about 121 million records. Those are transcribed text records, and those 121 million records really represents to us 300 or 400 million records, because some of those are like hundreds of fish in a jar or many butterflies in a tray or whatever that might be databased together. We've been working very, very hard with that. We also have a database of about 30-something million media records, which are images, videos, CT scans, et cetera, of those specimens, which we are also pushing very hard on. And I think my real interest in ExcelNet comes from the fact that we have a very close working relationship with the Global Biodiversity Informatics Facility, which is a global, international, about 120 or 100 countries, I forget exactly the number now. They have slightly more specimen data records than we do, although a lot of those are probably the ones that we also have. And they also take observational data, which by cooperative agreement with NSF we do not do. We were strictly museum collections oriented. And and we worked very closely with the Australian Atlas of Living Australia and the folks in Canberra. We've been there several times, and they've come to see us and visit with us. We work very closely with the new DISCO, which is the new project in Europe that contains about 121 nations and many collections that they are building something similar to IDIG Bio. We work with China, Caping Ma in China, NSII has been very cooperative with us. And we are currently meeting informally, regularly, to make sure that we're not all on separate paths. But as anything, when you're working together in out of goodwill, goodwill doesn't always pay the bills, and goodwill doesn't always keep you focused. And so we would like to be involved in ExcelNet so that we can be focused. We can have a reason to be focused. We are just about to put on board through IDIG Bio, through an NSF supplement, a global communications coordinator whose job it will be to keep us connected and keep us all moving in the same direction, because all of these things are developing at the same time, and we know that in the end, all data is probably going to migrate to one place. We're going to be using similar ingestion strategies, the same standards, all of that. And we don't need to be going this direction while we're building. We need to be going this direction while we're building so we can support that. And so that's IDIG Bio's goal over the next several years. Although Claire will probably say, yeah, but your funding is up in 2 years. We don't intend for that to happen. We think we'll be going on at least another 5 or 6 years, because the NSF is going to fund new TCNs, new projects within our bailiwick, and it's folks that we'll need to provide service to. So we're hoping to move on with that regard. But in any event, we think worldwide, these are the largest networks in biodiversity data in the world, and we need to be working even more closely together. Right now we meet kind of ad hoc when we happen to all be at the same conference at the same time. We meet online, but our plan is to have much more intensive meeting between developers and folks who can actually make this happen. So that's where we are. Thank you very much.
Hi, my name is Leslie Reese. I'm an assistant professor at Georgetown University, and I participate in and lead several networks that I'll be talking about later today. And I was also a research scientist here at SESYNC, where I started some of these networks. And so it's great for me to be back, and I'm also excited to hear more about ExcelNet.
Hi, I'm Jessica Vitak. I am an associate professor at the University of Maryland, and I'm also here today to share some of my experiences in creating and growing different types of centers, labs, and national and international networks. So you'll be hearing from me later.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Guy Lotracchiano. I come from George Washington University, just down the street. I'm associate professor in the School of Medicine and Health Sciences. I spend a lot of my time working on team science issues. My own research is specifically dedicated to motivation in teams and trying to understand what motivates people or demotivates them to work collaboratively. I also work in communication and transdisciplinary teams. I'll be speaking later today a little bit about looking at the sort of life cycle of what it means to be a scientist in a teaming environment. I'm also the University Associate Dean for Innovative and Collaborative Pedagogy and the president of the International Network for the Science of Team Science, which I hope you all join. And if you're interested in our conferences, we could talk at a coffee break as well, because we have a conference coming up at Duke. So it was nice to meet everyone, and I look forward to our discussion.
Hello, everyone. My name is Roberto Delgado. I'm a program director in the Office of Polar Programs at the National Science Foundation. I'm involved in a number of Arctic observing networks, both domestically through the U.S. Federal Interagency and also internationally across the circumpolar Arctic. I'm paired this afternoon with Guy in the session Defining a Collective Mission Vision, and I'll be presenting a bit of a case study, hopefully sharing some best practices and lessons learned.
I'm Cindy Parr. I'm kind of an ambassador to USDA. I know most of you in the room here are in the NSF world, and I came from that world primarily in biodiversity. So a lot of the stuff that Gil talked about, I worked on as a leader in the Encyclopedia of Life project when I was at the Smithsonian Institution. But for the past 5 years, I've been at USDA, where I'm working primarily on open data and big data, strategic planning, policy, and infrastructure. And I am a PI on 2 USDA-funded projects right now. One is a series of best practices for data management workshops, and the other is just beginning, and that has to do with data harmonization for crop modeling internationally. So you'll hear more about that from me later this afternoon.
I'm Owen White. I'm at the University of Maryland. I'm Assistant Director of the Institute for Genome Sciences. I've been primarily involved in the National Institutes of Health research space. I've been involved with many large data generation projects having to do with looking at microbiome, as well as human data. We are deeply involved with team science for management of harmonization of metadata associated with patient phenotypes and lots of important health topics in that area. And I'd say that one of the things that I think is bringing us a lot together is that the data generation that's now going on in the sequencing space is so huge that it's really requires that lots of interdisciplinary teams get together at the level of doing bioinformatics, which is my original background, as well as collecting samples from patients and lots of things like that. So. Who's next? Oh, back there.
Good morning, everybody. I'm John Kramer. I'm the Director for Interdisciplinary Science here at SESYNC. My work here in a broad sense is focused on the design and implementation of programs and then ultimately evaluation of not just those individual programs, but this complex space and organization that we've stood up over the last 8 years. In a little more specific sense, I'm very interested in working on the practical aspects of team science, how to help interdisciplinary teams function in a very day-to-day manner, and that can extend everything from planning and design of their projects all the way to facilitation and help with resolving conflicts and developing opportunities. It's nice to have you all here and look forward to meeting you over the course of the next day and a half.
Hi everyone, I'm Rebecca Balanson. I also work here at SESYNC. I'm the research program manager, so I work with Carrie and John supporting our synthesis teams that come through the center, and I'm excited to be in the workshop and help support everything.
Thank you all for introducing yourselves. We've got a great diverse group here. I look forward to the discussions during the coffee breaks and lunch. I think we'll have some really interesting discussion. We do have a few minutes before our first break, so I'd like to invite Dr. Margaret Palmer, to come back and take any questions you might have had after her presentation.
And I will be around throughout the day, so we can also chat one-on-one. But if there's any questions at this point, I'm happy to.
Very
yes,
quick
Catherine.
You
Yeah.
mentioned a book.
Steve Fiore. What's the title of that book?
It is called Team Metacognition. I will tell you, I'll warn you that it is theory.
Okay.
And one of the things we found when we were designing SESYNC and beginning is that, and Guy might have a tick when I say this, but is that a lot of the work on team science was very theoretical, and that trying to take that from the theory to the practice was not easy. But we did start with a lot of that literature, also the literature from organizational science and other fields, and try and say, okay, this is the theory. How could we possibly, put something in practice that would be directed at that?
So just as a follow-on comment, would it be possible to it's just occurring to me, would it be possible, or if you think it would be useful, to have a place where we could post resources that we think the group might be interested in sharing, or maybe we're planning on doing that?
I think absolutely we can do that. We do have, a collection of sort of good papers to read on team science and other resources, as well as other issues. So sure, we can do that. And at some point before the conference is over, we can let you know where that is.
Absolutely.
Oh, sorry. Okay, yeah.
Just along those lines, and I apologize if I missed this earlier, but the presentations, your presentation, other presentations, will they be made available online somewhere where we can go access them?
Yes, yes.
Yes,
Okay.
all the presentations, and we will put up a reading list on different topics, and we'll ask some of our speakers to also provide key literature.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? That might be for Carrie back there. Go ahead.
I think that throughout your presentation, you mentioned that you use SESYNC as a case study. Could you elaborate on, say, like the genesis of your center, how it evolved into what it is today, pitfalls that you had to avoid and problems that you have to overcome as, maybe best practices and lessons to be, shared with us to avoid those pitfalls? And
Well, that's a big question, and I'm probably going to ask John to come up here as well, if you would, John, because he's going, oh, really? There's a lot we could cover. So I'll start with talking about the genesis, and if you're not familiar with this, NSF has had a number of synthesis centers, and the idea behind a synthesis center, and they've mostly come out of the Biodirectorate, is that there's a lot of data and information out there, and so rather than starting every project by collecting new original data, what kinds of questions can we address using existing data, theories, and models? And so NSF put out a call for an environmental synthesis center, but our view, both myself, John, and other members of the leadership, in part because of our own research, we're aware that environmental problems are social problems, and that oftentimes the social dynamics are the reason that the environmental problems persist. So we proposed a socio-environmental synthesis center. Now, the idea behind synthesis centers is that they are team-focused. And so the funding we have is to support teams of people from around the world. They submit proposals to us to address questions in which they can use existing data, theories, and models. Now, having said that, there's an awful lot that's involved, and I'm going to try to just hit on some of the things I think are relevant to this network of networks. One is it takes resources. A good network, a good facilitated teams, and helping those teams is not something that just happens easily. In our case, because it's a synthesis center, we have a large computational team that actually provides significant help to our individual teams. What's relevant to you? Don't assume all the members of your network will be able to write code, will understand how to access data portals, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Another thing I think that's relevant is we are a service organization. If you're the leader of a network, you've got to be someone who is willing to provide a service. It's a lot of work, and Oftentimes, in my case, my own research didn't benefit directly from running the center. Help me think of things to weigh in on, John.
Yeah, thanks, Margaret. I think another piece to think about, as you asked about the history of the center and how we evolved, and I'll talk a little bit about this tomorrow afternoon. But at the core in the early days, it was a commitment of those in the leadership of the center to challenge ourselves and learn continuously. And I would say that's not generally an easy process. We all think we know how to do things, and I think what we learned, because we were doing something that was very new, is that we didn't know all the time how to do things, and we had to figure out on the fly. And someone mentioned startups. We were very much a startup culture when the doors opened. Margaret mentioned people, and I think the other piece of this puzzle that was so powerful was commitment by the people here to be invested in the center and its development over time. And then finally, the processes that Margaret showed on the slide a little while ago were the result of lots of hard work in attempting to do things really directed around how do we best serve the community that we wanted to benefit from our work here, and how do we build their capacity. And over time, what we developed is a theory of change on what we wanted to do. We felt very strongly that this had to be not separate efforts, but really well-coordinated efforts. Learning how to do that is really, I think, part of the thing perhaps we're both most proud of over the course of the 8 years that we've been in existence.
Yeah, and I would just add to that to understand that we're just an example. The issues you have and the challenges will be different. So the reason we needed all those processes and structures and approaches and a highly iterative leadership approach is because we were trying to bring together some of the most interdisciplinary teams out there. So we're talking a team that includes a climate scientist, a psychologist, an economist. And so our mission was not just the production of great research. That was one of them. But it was to build capacity to do interdisciplinary science and build new communities. Now, one of your goals is to build new communities. Capacity to do interdisciplinary work may or may not be core part of what your centers are. So I don't want you to think our center is a perfect example. Each topic you have is going to have some unique issues. But I think what John said is pretty accurate, willingness to experiment, try, and move forward. And I just can't emphasize enough the role of the leaders in direct contact. If the leader becomes sort of a titular head and is not in direct contact with key people in the network or people in the network, it just won't work. People want to talk to the person at the top, and they want them to be engaged. If there's other specific things, there's a lot we could cover. We actually have a paper we have written on the process of facilitating interdisciplinary, which we will put online for others to read. I also say questions for me are great, but also you may want to ask questions of one another, because we have some really interesting people in the audience here. Yes, Cindy.
All right, so with that, actually, I'll toss this question out for everyone. You've mentioned concepts like lean startups, or actually you didn't use the word lean startup, but I know that that's what I recognized in some of your slides, and that's from the business world. And then theories of change and organizational theory. These are all things that are broader than the science community. So what can any of you share about how you think the scientific community is just like these other kinds of communities, and how much are they different? How much do we have to adapt those theories for the scientific enterprise?
I know there must be opinions on that. I'll start with one thing, which is you may have to be willing to push back on your program officers. So, for example, we used a developmental evaluation approach for the first 5 years, which means we did not set out to do a controlled study on what worked and what didn't. We didn't have control groups. We did work, as you say, in the lean fashion as a startup, where we would try stuff. And we had close communication among the leadership. We watched our teams, we watched the networks, we sat in on part of what they were doing, we talked to them, and then we would have discussions, and it would be, I'm not sure that's working, let's try this. And the site review teams don't really like that. well, where is your, your formal evaluation? What are your metrics? Now, we did the bean counting that we all need to do, number of papers published, number of people from different disciplines, et cetera. But the hard part, and John's going to talk a little bit about this today, it's really hard. How do you measure things like increased capacity to work in interdisciplinary teams? That is really hard to do, and we were trying to accelerate that, not necessarily do a study on it the way a scientist of team science might do. So, yes, and then we'll go to the front. Yes.
Speaking to Cindy's question, I think one of the main problems that we're facing, maybe it's just me, maybe other people shared this perspective, is that let's call it disciplinary scientists are very often very bogged down into the minutiae of their own discipline. Once that we start reaching out into, in my own personal case, education first, to make those researchers aware that there's so much scholarship on education as there is on chemistry, biology, you name it, it's already, a pretty high activation energy. I'm a chemist, so I have to. And
to use chemistry.
Yeah, and speaking of that, even the language, it's important. When I talk to other chemists or physicists about this education opportunity, which will require an IRB, they have to start from scratch. So going back to the startup culture, that risk aversion, it's an important hurdle that we have to get past, and I'm sure that with this, network initiative, network of networks, team science, it's very likely going to be like the same thing. You have to get them up to speed and on board, and that's a challenge in itself.
So your comment about learning what science of education is about, that's an example of making sure everybody understands what different individuals bring to the team. And it's also an example of sort of eliciting tacit knowledge with respect to language. People will use words, and it's important to have an atmosphere where individuals are comfortable saying, what does that mean? Or that's not what I think that means. Stephen, you had a comment?
Yeah, just...
Wait just a minute for the microphone, if you would. I know we're getting Carrie running around. But
That's my exercise for the day.
So just the notion of what's the difference between sort of a commercial lean startup and something like this kind of enterprise. I've experienced in both worlds. My life is probably going to be much shorter because of it. But aside from the fact that you think as hard as you can possibly work to get these things going, and it takes like 10 times that, that's pretty similar between the two. The difference, I think, is I think there are opportunities in this kind of environment to be much more adaptive, and I think this came out in the previous discussion about how SESYNC formed itself and had to sort of rethink a lot of things as they went along. That being open to be adaptive is absolutely critical, because there's so many ideas that are littering the highway of these kinds of projects that, you just need to be able to be, okay, let's take a deep breath and think about this, and what do we have to do? Let's call our program officer and say, this just isn't working. This is what we're thinking. What do you think we should be doing now? And just be able to be open to adapting to something new and rethinking something, maybe even from the ground up.
Other comments? Claire and then Leslie?
I just want to reiterate one point of that adaptation, because much of ExcelNet is all about linking U.S. and international networks. And when you work in that international realm, the context is often changing very rapidly. And so that ability to adapt is absolutely critical.
And I'll also say, and then we'll pass to Leslie, please, back in the back. She had her hand up. With respect to the difference between business and the kind of thing we're doing, the other thing that the science of team science has emphasized is that usually when we think of teams, we think of things like, groups in the Army, groups in the military, where there are clearly defined roles for individuals in that team. That's not at all the case. Not only is that not the case, our mission isn't as clearly defined as it is, and even so, let's say a surgical team in an operating room. We don't know where we're going because what we're doing is about discovery. So that's why this adaptation really is important, and we are very different from most other teams. Leslie?
So I was actually in the business world for 10 years before coming to academia, and one of the things, first of all, and I've brought a lot of those skills, and one of the things I've noticed that's really different about academia is, first of all, there can sometimes be a certain disdain for the kind of attitudes you get from the real world, the business world, where you have to think about the return on investment, or you have to realize that if you're trying to build something, it's one thing to try to do a research project, you can do it and publish it, but if you're trying to build a network, there has to be a market for that network. There have to be people out there who are interested in what you're doing, and this is probably one of the hardest things, the customer is always right. You know, even if you disagree with them, they always have the option to walk away. And then the last thing I'll say is I feel like there's always this resistance to how important leadership and management is. You know, in my field, there's a real tendency for people when they're putting in NSF grants to not put in summer salary for themselves. Oh, we should be giving that to the graduate students. No, you need to build in and honor the fact that this is going to take your time and that it's a really important part of the project. No business would start a business giving zero money to the manager.
I believe we had in the front, and then Guy in the back, and then this gentleman in front of him.
Yeah, so one question, or one comment just about working within the research community. I think, and it was mentioned here by Claire, or brought up, you know, you're dealing with culture. And so if you're working across disciplines, a network, it requires individuals to trust one another. And if you're siloed in your discipline and you're not really understanding what your partners or other pieces of the network, perhaps it's the content, or perhaps it's the methodologies or things like that, how do you get beyond that barrier to develop the sort of level of trust that's needed to create a cohesive network? And I think that's one. I think the other thing is just human nature. Science is grounded in argumentation and in critical review. And again, when you go back to some of the things, you know, a network needs to be able to interact socially. And so people need to be able to interact socially. And that's when emotions come in and feelings can get hurt if you're arguing at the wrong moment and time. And so I think that trying to understand what's the right mode of operation for whichever environment you're in at that point in time. Are you interacting socially, and how do you, because that can also help you to build trust. So I think that those are a couple key issues to work or to try to resolve within any network, is the cultural differences, and it could be international cultural differences, it could be cultural differences across disciplines, and then it's what domain are you interacting in at any point in time, and when's the right time to argue, and when's the right time to just have a coffee or a good glass of wine.
And if anyone has examples of how to facilitate social interactions when you mostly interact remotely, it would be great to hear your experiences, because it is true, there's a lot of work showing that social interactions lead to trust.
In listening to the comments, it draws my attention to a couple themes. I think, Eduardo, how you mentioned when you're seeking support, you know, how do you write into your plans these sort of needed aspects of the project, which have to do with process, have to do with teaming, and don't have so much to do directly with the scientific problem that you're dealing with. And I think our culture of science is changing, and I think it's changing rather rapidly, where process is becoming more important to even reviewers. I think there's some reviewers that don't even want to look at that, but the job of any scientist is to bring the appropriate science to the person or people that are decision makers in how that science is going to be supported. And it reminds me of, as a mixed methods sort of person, where you go on and on and on about how you're going to do your quantitative analysis, and then you say something like in 2 sentences, and then we're going to use qualitative methods to analyze the interviews. It's sort of, there's an entire, it's sort of like saying, and we're going to do all this by using team science principles. There's a science to it. And I think as scientists, it's part of our job, no matter what your discipline or sector is, to bring that science to the people that are, and that's hard, but it's just as hard as if you're working on a complex problem and you need a biochemist and you know nothing about biochemistry. It's the same effort. I think also, too, it's important to understand, especially in, it doesn't matter if you're in health, biomed, if you're in sustainability, the teams are also going through a culture change where more and more we ask the question, why aren't the people who have the problem part of the scientific team? Why is it only those people from the academy that get to be on the scientific team? And I think this is something that is really sort of a challenge to those of us that are in the academy, because, when you write a grant, or if you're putting together a team just to do a project and you include, say, for instance, a parent of a child with autism, the team often says, well, what does this person know about research design? I said, they know more than anyone knows about the problem, and that is about research design. So I think over time, the academy, and I think there's a number of people here that sort of live on this bridge, the academy needs to understand how to work with career professionals. And when I use the term professionals, people who have experiential knowledge and or skills that contribute to the scientific program, that we have to, and we have a responsibility to describe as critical to the outcomes we're expecting of doing the science. We can't do a team science project without those people involved that are skilled in process or skilled in whatever needs that you need, skilled in helping manage networks, et cetera. Or we can't possibly talk about the needs of children's health care without at least parents who have children who need, it affects the agenda of the science. And back to your point, it's the responsibility of the scientist to make the case as to why this is important to the success of the scientific enterprise.
Right in front of you.
I'm not sure if it gets it. Steve, I know, has been trying to get it.
Yeah, Steve goes next after that, yeah.
Okay. No, just coming from industry again and the business side, one thing that we have, I would like to ask also, what, in terms of SESYNC, what has been the role of industry? We have been taking advantage of the transition to practice initiatives at NSF, for example, to make practical many of the research, work done at universities. And one of the things we see is that, very few researchers actually are interested on the TTP option on a grant, because it involves actual deployment, actual implementation, actual, practical, application of the research. But at the same time, we found that, for example, I also a NSF Innovation Corp mentor. So we found that if they get the training in those, for example, the NSF I-Corp initiative, they actually are very, very effective. The things that they never had that training. Once they are exposed to that, then they understand how important it is to see the application of the research in real life or real implementations. And we would like to help that process. And that's what actually I'm trying to do, right? And we are also not mentioning, for example, national labs. So one of the things that we do is also bringing national labs into the equation. So we have academia, we have government, and we have industry. And it's not just startups. It might be companies, well-established companies, but they already have the networks, they already have the connection, they already have the needs, actually, in many cases. We just need to make that integration, but that bridge between the two, right?
Which is why that program's so great, the I-Corps, yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to make that emphasis on that, and maybe ask, what has been the role of industry on SESYNC, or what could be that role?
We have so many interesting people ready to speak, so we can talk at the break about that. Steve?
I just want to get back to Cindy's question about the organizational literature, something I know well, and point out, because of the conversation, that any form of organizing is a set of trade-offs. That's just what we're talking about, is a set of trade-offs. And the hard thing is, what are we trading off? So the startup culture, so you're trading off risk versus reward. The funding cycle, quarterly versus 3 to 5 years with the 1-year non-cost extension. We have a high temporary labor force in academia. Several of you have announced that you've moved from place to place and are doing things. So we're actually much better than the current non-science workforce in managing turnover in workforce. So we've been giggers for a lot longer than the gig economy has been around. We're talking a little bit about the way that networks work, and so you may move from place to place, but you don't leave your network, right? And most young professors know that the network is more important than the job at the moment, because the network will sustain you and the job will not. And so we actually have a lot of this. What's interesting is that most people enter that literature, or enter that experience of being in an organization with a lot less skill than you would expect, right? And now I guess the question I'm asking you is, it's a trade-off. It's a cost to manage a team. It's a cost to run a network. You talked about this. And so the question that I would keep on asking is, does the cost of being a team scientist, running your team like a team science project, is it better than just half-assing it that we've been doing for so long? Because it may be that half-assing it, technical term, is actually a not bad approach for small teams, but it probably isn't a good approach for 80-person teams. And so I think that a lot of what I was hoping to get out of this is the trade-offs of when do you make a decision about the kind of organizing.
Yeah, the only comment I'd add to that is one of the most common mistakes we see in scientific teams is, and it's actually more common in my area, in sort of the biophysical sciences, is the PI taking charge. This is what we're going to do. And that really, leadership is about, as John says, which I love this comment he made at one point, if he's facilitated a room, if he's been a leader, when he walks out at the end of the day and they're all talking to each other and don't even notice him, it's been good leadership. And I think that's a great quote. Go ahead, Gil.
I want to talk just a minute about personnel. You talked about, this is not a military type operation where you have very defined roles, very defined organizational missions and all that sort of stuff. And I think that's absolutely the case. And I think it's very, very important in network of networks and in running a network that you understand when you bring personnel in, you're not, because you're a biologist, you don't go look for a biologist. You look for somebody who can do the job that you want them to do. And in IDIC Bio's experience, we value very highly autonomy. So we try to hire smart people with a lot of go get them. And one of the questions I like to ask is, how do you feel about not having direct supervision? How do you feel about having to decide what you're going to do and make some of those decisions? And if they say, well, I really like to have a supervisor, then I probably don't want to hire them. I would rather have somebody. And one of the things that our previous director used to say regularly, and I think it's absolutely true, is that there is so much to do that if you find something you really like within our group, probably nobody else is working on it. It's valuable, and you should move that direction and do it, because there's more to do than we have time to do to begin with. So if you're good at something and you're moving our organization forward, we will value that. So that autonomous behavior, I think, in this realm is very, very important. And then the second thing that we really strive for is cross-functionality. We don't want people that can do one thing, and I don't want to feel like that I have to go to Steve to find out if Claire can do this for me because she works for Steve. We finally redid our organizational chart not long ago, and now we have a Venn diagram. We don't have lines and boxes. We're all in concentric circles, and we decide you're in this circle, but you're kind of overlapping that circle. So if they need your help, give it to them, and don't go to this person up here to get permission. Just do it, because the work has to get done. So I think cross-functionality of people and autonomous behavior for us has been extremely important, even though it can be a little bit nerve-wracking from time to time if somebody gets a little too autonomous. But by and large, we think that's very important.
Very good. Who else? Pamela, maybe? And I am apologizing if I'm missing the order of people, so we'll go up here next. Pamela's right back there, down the end of, yeah.
Hello, everybody. I was just texting one of my friends that this conversation is amazing. So 2 quick points I'd like to make. One, coming back to Margaret's earlier request that we comment on what we've seen work for collaborations remote. So the person I was just texting, I was just on a call with this morning. It's a remote consortium of people all around the world. And what I've seen that works really well for that consortium and for others that I'm a part of is a couple of things. Having meetings that occur regularly, but not at a rhythm that's too burdensome because everyone's busy. So like once a week, once every second week, once every 3 weeks, depending on the needs. So it's predictable. People build it into their calendars. I find that very effective. Where bandwidth permits, I find using video incredibly important. It's
Yes,
such a
it
tiny
is.
thing, but just being able to see facial expression, to be able to figure out, when you want to contribute, like, people's faces change when they're about to talk. Having that kind of nonverbal feedback, I find really valuable. And then, for each of those meetings, you want to make sure you're not just meeting for the sake of having a meeting. You want to have something you want to achieve. And then the outcome of that meeting needs to set up what you want to achieve for the next meeting, and agendas need to be shared. So people know they can prepare, they know what they're in for. And I also would, my preference is to keep them short and sweet. I find, if you force people to do everything within 30 minutes, you'd be surprised at how concise people can get. I was not concise just now, but those are some things that I've seen work in the different projects that I've been on. And then I also wanted to make a quick second point. What I've seen very effective and pitfalls I've seen engaging with the private sector. So I've been in academia, I've been in government, I've been in the NGO space, I briefly dabbled in the private sector. Of those 4 categories, so what I think I understand is the pressure on people's time in the private sector, how they have to account for every 15 minutes, how they spend, who they charge to for those 15-minute increments. That limits how much they can engage. So I've been at workshops where, we want to invite people from across all 4 of those categories. The private sector folks show up for 1 day of the 4, or like half a day. Or if you want people to join meetings every week, they'll show up for like 30 minutes the first call, and then you never see them again. That's fine, because if what we can do in these other sectors, if we can have a clear, someone said the phrase value proposition, I love that phrase. If you can go to them with a clear value proposition, understand what they need, say, okay, great, now we know what you need, we'll get back to you when we figured it out, instead of expecting them to engage more routinely the way folks from other sectors are more free to do. I feel like having those constraints that folks in the private sector face clearly in mind when planning how to engage with them, I find very helpful as well.
I think that's incredibly important, and we've even tried when we can to compensate people for their time, which if you have the
Thanks for that.
resources, that's great.
Let me just quickly jump in with a comment from the live stream.
Great, yes.
So we have a comment from Nancy Grimm that we in the Urban Resilience Network, an NSF-funded network, do almost all of our interacting on Zoom, but the in-person annual all-hands meetings are hugely important for cementing social connections. So just a voice from the live stream.
Yeah, in person, and then also when you do have these calls, video is critical, because we all know if we're just on the phone, you start double tasking, et cetera, et cetera. Go ahead, Ariane.
Yes, super fascinating conversation. So one of the things that was interesting for me taking over a global research project sort of midstream as a sort of older kind of science, I would say, under IGBP, was the International Geosphere Biosphere Program was transferring into this newer kind of science under Future Earth. And I think what was really interesting was some of the things that you've discussed in the beginning, Margaret, about leadership were really interesting, because the science, the scientific steering committee at that point was charged for, sort of devising a science plan, directing it, and sort of then sending out the troops to create the science. And so, we were very clear, I think, within the scientific steering committee when I came on board, that that was not going to be the model for the Global Land Program moving forward, and that it was going to be a much more lateral organization with sort of seeking to kind of create that kind of effervescence, that activation throughout the network, knowing that it's such a big field and we need to activate it all at once, and we don't have a lot of resources. And so how to kind of create something where everyone is kind of carrying a part of this moving, raft. But the challenge has been, and I think also partly why I'm here and so compelled to build, to kind of stretch out into other networks through the AccelNet program, is that we don't have the cyber infrastructure and sort of the even sort of soft infrastructure in place. We're still kind of learning by doing. How do you lateralize a network, and then how do you create the the communication channels beyond Zoom and webinars, and to really kind of create these new structures is a challenge for us. And I think also, we are behind in the U.S. in terms of the international funding for science through our traditional channels. In principle, I feel like we're starting to get that this TD approach, transdisciplinary approaches, or what we call interdisciplinary approaches here in the U.S. are so fundamental, but I don't sense that our programs are quite there yet in understanding the need for that kind of infrastructure and the fact that we have to pay for it. There's only so much you can build on people's backs for free.
And I will comment on the first part of what you said, where the leadership decides what has to be done and then distributes it. And that reminds me of the phrase, the loading dock model, which is like you have a dump truck, you bring it up, you dump it. And that is the phrase that's often used for traditional communication by scientists. We're going to do the work, discover things, and then we'll do outreach and we'll deliver it. And then things will change, and it doesn't work that way. So, other comments? Let's move back here to Cindy, and then we'll come back to you, Eduardo.
Great discussion, and I want to put in my 2 cents from my perspective to my own questions. So it's sort of been touched on before, but I think one of the differences between the scientific enterprise and business in particular is the amount of autonomy that scientists are given and expected to have, which is great because of being able to surface innovative new ideas, but can also be a hindrance when you're trying to build a large network and you've got a lot of people who've been rewarded for their entire careers to toot their own horn and toot their own ideas and not necessarily do so in a team context. So, and then in the business world, where it's a very top-down decision-making chain where basically the boss decides the direction and then everybody has to fall in line, and they of course suffer from problems of, well, how do you bring the message up that maybe that is not a good direction? How do the people who are actually in the trenches doing the work be heard as to what they think could work better or could, so business cultures are struggling with the opposite kind of problem. Now, as a federal employee in an agency that does science, the Agricultural Research Service sort of has elements of both of these cultures. So we're accountable to taxpayers. We get relatively large amounts of money that gets spread very thinly across all the scientists. So it's not like it's well funded, but it's basically to accomplish particular initiatives or objectives. And then we struggle because our scientists are just like your scientists. They've been rewarded for autonomy, but they have to work within this sort of top-down structure. So that's the tension that we're dealing with, and that's why I'm here, because we're doing our best to sort of make the best of both of these worlds. And the last thing I want to say is you asked about techniques for bringing the social aspect to these distributed communications. So I work on agile software development, and our teams of developers are all around the world. And the particular agreement we have right now is with, they're a for-profit company, but they do government nonprofit kind of work. And they start every half-hour scrum with everybody talking about their balance. And so you basically give yourself a score of where you are on a scale of 1 to 10, how you're feeling today, and usually people toss in a little explanation about why. I'm really stressed out because I've got lots of deadlines, or I just took a vacation and so my balance is high, or it's Friday, I'm really happy because it's the weekend, or I really made a lot of progress on my work, so my scores, usually the scores are between 6 and 8. Very rarely do we get as high as 9. Very rarely do we get below a 5, but if somebody gives you a 5, you know that you need to approach them carefully because they're on the edge.
Watch out.
But it definitely has helped along with the visual
Okay, last comment goes to Eduardo, then we need to break.
No pressure.
No pressure.
Just like Cindy did, I would like circle back to my original comment and thank you all for the discussion, particularly Timothy and also you, Margaret, because it seems at least to me that communication, it's at least one of the common themes that has to be resolved for a network of networks to become effective, not only in terms of, say, relationship between the private sector and academia. I've had that problem where the private sector being driven by deadlines and profits would ask you for the results of some analysis yesterday, and you have other things to do, like, I don't know, teaching or a report. Also internationally, the culture being different. Here in the US, you may produce results, but if it's August and a collaborator in France needs to do something, it's not going to happen. And it's not going to happen for the next month, So at least to me, knowing how to navigate all those communication-related issues seems to be one of the main issues that have to be resolved. And obviously, several people also mentioned resources. Maybe that's where NSF comes in.
Great. I think that those are really important points, and emphasize that it's very time-consuming. So go ahead and assume that's going to be the case. So with that, we'll take a break.
We'll
Carrie?
take a half-an-hour break, and there'll be coffee in the back.
Great comments.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay, great. Welcome back. In this session, we're going to hear from Dr. Claire Hemingway, who is a program officer in the Office of International Science and Engineering at NSF. And her talk will be entitled, "What is the Network-to-Network Approach?" She is leading the new NSF-wide program to foster the creation of international networks of networks called ExcelNet. Before joining NSF, she led a collaborative initiative across more than 18 international scientific organizations to enhance engagement in the scientific enterprise and scientific literacy by harnessing digital learning technologies to provide innovative online mentoring for student research teams. She recently served as an Embassy Science Fellow at the U.S. Embassy in Ottawa, Canada. So thank you, Claire.
So my thanks to Carrie and Margaret and John and the whole team here at SESYNC. We're delighted that you're hosting this. And what I will do here in my brief presentation is to do a rather high-level description of how NSF has come to this network of network approaches. I know some people may be interested in the details of the solicitation, but I'll be offering webinars for the research community to get into those sort of nitty-gritty details. But I want to give you a sense of how we have come to develop an international network-to-network collaboration program. So I'll start with a bit of context about NSF. And as many of you know, being funded by NSF or involved in NSF funded projects, that NSF has funded research collaborations across various scales, small to large, research collaborations that have an institutional hub and those that are widely distributed and have no home base. The collaborations are very diverse that NSF has funded. And so I provide here some examples of collaborative research programs, such as one from the Office of International Science and Engineering, PIRE, Partnerships in International Research and Education. There are other focused collaborative efforts, such as the Dimensions of Biodiversity program that have run. At larger scales, there are the centers, like the synthesis centers, the engineering research centers, the science and technology centers, all of which have a specific purpose in bringing people to collaborate. I'm going to focus more on the research networks and how they have fed into the network of network approach. What I do want to highlight is at all of these levels of research collaboration that NSF has funded, there are some that have explicitly called for international activities to be a part of it, and many others that have welcomed international collaboration, but that's not been an explicit purpose of the opportunity. So I also want to highlight that no matter what the scale, small or large, or no matter the focus being centered in a hub or having a distributed focus, as the research collaborations expand in scope and scale, there's some common features to the research calls. And so I did a little Wordle, pulling terms from the calls for proposals from the larger scale collaborative programs. And you'll see that they're all calling for many similar features. And that's that coordination and management are called out as items that proposers must pay attention to and provide plans for. That the strategic research theme and the vision and the goals have to be clearly defined in these large-scale research collaborations, and that the participants are the focus of many of the activities, and the evaluation of how those activities will play out is critical. So I highlight the fact that no matter which of these collaborative programs is called for. There are some common features because collaborating at scale requires some fundamental activities. Many of you mentioned in your introduction that you've been involved in research coordination networks, and NSF has made a substantial investment in supporting the Research Coordination Network program. Its purpose has been to catalyze new networks. It supports networks in all areas that NSF funds, and there are often calls for research coordination networks that are associated with specific special programs at NSF. And I list a couple here. The Infuse, Innovations at the Nexus of Food, Water, and Energy, has funded research coordination networks. The Coupled Natural and Human Systems program has funded research coordination networks. There was a long-standing effort called SEES that funded quite a number of research coordination networks. And if you went to the NSF website and used the search feature to look for projects that had been funded, and you used the advanced search function, typing in research coordination networks, you would come up with quite a large sample size, over 3,000. So what I want to highlight is that NSF has been investing in catalyzing specific networks for a long period of time, and that there have been a number of networks funded under sort of large research themes. And that provides quite a body of researchers out there who may have been working in independent networks that could do new things if they created synergies by linking their networks. NSF has also funded a number of explicitly international networks, and I highlight one here that just got off the ground this year. It is an international network collaboration explicitly focused in the neurosciences, and it's a collaborative effort with NSF and counterpart funding agencies in the UK, in Germany, and in Canada. And this call explicitly looks for collaborative networks that involve researchers in at least two of those countries, and brings together researchers of about 15 to 20 partners across those two or more countries that are going to explicitly look at experimentation, analysis, and new discoveries in neuroscience. And I'm highlighting a piece from their solicitation that the emphasis here on scales much larger than could be done otherwise. And that really is much of what a network is all about. Collaborating in order to work at a scale that is not possible within a smaller research team that maybe you are all going to publish together. The networks are more loosely affiliated on larger research themes. So scale matters. And that's where I want to turn to the fact that the investments that NSF has made in fostering our own domestic research networks and facilitating these international collaborative networks means that there is a wide array of networks that can have the possibility to be scaled to networks of networks. And it's a different level of engagement than NSF has funded before. So as Margaret mentioned, the center is an experiment. Well, this international network-to-network collaboration is also somewhat of an experiment. We're starting this year. We'll see where we go. We hope to adapt over time. And part of the way we adapt is by bringing the community together to learn what questions, concerns you have, what we are not providing that you need. And this effort to scale from catalyzing a single network that's focused in one area to supporting networks of networks that are linked to create new synergies across different networks is something that we are pretty confident that there is a need for, but we are not sure that we understand all the needs of the community yet. So I'll thank you in advance for going along this journey with us together. So what I want to do is tell you a little bit about the ExcelNet program. I'm going to jump back and forth between some specifics about ExcelNet and then background that informed how we developed this program. So it is explicitly scaling from catalyzing a single network to supporting networks of networks. And explicitly what we mean by that is we want to support strategic linkages among U.S. research networks and complementary networks abroad that are tackling grand scientific challenges that require a coordinated effort in an international domain. So I'm going to step back now to talk about a bit of terminology. We've already mentioned in a couple of our conversations about language matters, the terms that we use matter, and we might not all be using language in the same way, so being explicit about what we mean is often helpful. Interestingly enough, the terms network are used a lot, but rarely actually clearly defined. And so what I've done here is pull a study from 2017 that was looking at the research enterprise in Norway. And in this article, they define a research group as a collaboration that is institutionally based. And they define a network as a collaboration that crosses institutional boundaries. They also comment, of course, that things can be blurred and that there are realities of research collaborations occurring simultaneously at multiple scales. So what do I mean by that? I'll actually give you a little bit of the data. The study here surveyed researchers at universities in Norway and asked them, how do you collaborate to a large degree? Do you work alone? Do you work in an informal research group? Do you work in a formal research group? Are you part of an international network? Or no, are you both a part of a research group and part of an international network? And you can see the scientific domains in which they asked people to identify themselves were social science, natural science, technology, and medicine. And this may come as no surprise to you, but there are differences in disciplines in whether or not people typically work alone, like the social sciences working on their book that will be their best work ever and takes them a decade to prepare, or folks in medicine who typically work in a formal research group, part of their own school of medicine or institute, and the natural sciences, as you see, they work across all different kinds of collaborative efforts, but they're the ones who are often involved in those international networks and a combination of research groups and international networks. The point here is that most researchers are working in multiple ways as they collaborate and simultaneously, and the configurations in which they are collaborating are fulfilling different needs for their collaborative work, for their own research endeavors, and their complementary strategies to work in a smaller research group and a larger research network, international or not. So I'll turn back now to the ExcelNet program, and in the solicitation, we explicitly define a network and a network of networks. And I'll highlight that our definitions draw on the distribution of researchers. Are they institutionally based or dispersed across institutions? What is the function of that collaboration? And then what's the scope of the contribution of that research collaboration. So we define in the solicitation a network as an established, coordinated, and distributed group of scientific researchers who cooperate within or across fields to collect and share resources, knowledge, and expertise. So we have already tagged the fact that a network in our sense means that we do not expect researchers to all be at the same institution, same department, same institute, but to be brought together in sharing knowledge and data because of their common interest in their research problem. And they may be found distributed anywhere. And then we define a network of networks as a formal link amongst networks that's going to serve as a force multiplier or an amplifier with the explicit purpose of advancing the frontiers of science. That is, tackling a problem at such a large scale that it requires the synergies, the complementarity, the sharing of expertise and knowledge across more than one network. Because it as was mentioned earlier, diversity matters, and so those perspectives that each network has should, in a combinational effect, yield something that would allow a larger research problem to be advanced. So don't think at the scale of a narrow research topic that could be answered by a research team, but a major need in a disciplinary or interdisciplinary field that would propel that field forward. So the scope of the research contribution matters in the network of networks. Frankly, you wouldn't need to pull together researchers from so many places to tackle a small problem. It wouldn't be needed. So I'm going to hone in on this a little bit because we found as we were planning the ExcelNet program and unrolling the program that it was often difficult for people to distinguish what we meant by a network of networks and blurring what is a network versus what is a linkage across different networks. And so we explicitly try to drive home that we do not see a network of networks at something at a scale of 1 to 2 formal research groups here in the U.S. connecting to 1 to 2 formal research groups abroad. And that how those entities may be brought together in a research project that would be funded would have to have the activities and the benefits extending beyond the PI, co-PI, senior personnel, and those institutions that the individuals are connected to. That it really, to serve a network of networks, needs to actively involve and benefit the participants of the network. And then we also want to make somewhat of a distinction between the research networks that might be linked and stakeholders, that word was brought up earlier, the stakeholders that might play an important role in being a part of the research network effort to tackle a grand scientific challenge, but they may not be individuals who are actually doing the research. Or they may not be a network. So certainly folks working at a national lab may be doing research, but they are not necessarily a network if they are part of a national lab. They are already part of an established formal research group. And so we also want people to think carefully about what is a research group versus what is a stakeholder that may have a very important role in a network of networks, but is not functioning in the same way as a network of researchers who will devise the methodology and collect the data per se. So some of things that would fit our view as an ExcelNet network of networks is a configuration in which key roles were held by members of multiple networks, and that those benefits truly do reach out to all of the networks, and that there is open membership. So that, again, sort of to contrast it with a formal research group where your position in a formal research group may very well be because you belong to a department. And someone cannot simply join because they have a common interest. They actually have to be part of that institution. In our network of networks view, we see that what is connecting people is their shared research effort, and that being able to join because they have something to contribute to that research effort is what is important. We also view that that network of networks should have the capacity to evolve over time. Again, part of that is the open nature, that new participants could come in. Part of the evolution over time is that networks, as they make discoveries and understand really what their aligned missions can achieve, that they will need to adapt over time. So thinking of the network of networks as a living, growing, morphing entity is much more of what we have in mind than fixed entities that may have more rigid boundaries and have benefits all moving internally. So what I'll do next is to give you a little sense of some of the input we received to get to developing a call. We did, as I sort of alluded to by describing some of the scales at which NSF supports collaborations, look internally to see whether or not there was anything at NSF that was funding network of network scale. And really there's not in a grand way. So we felt confident that we are filling a need, at least from the NSF perspective. To cross-check that view with the research communities, we put out a Dear Colleague letter, and we asked for researchers to tell us, do they see that there is a need for a network of network opportunities in their research field, and if so, what sort of considerations should we be taking in as we were planning a program? And the responses of those Dear Colleague letters that were put out in 2017 indicated that across all fields that NSF funds, people see the opportunity for their research domain. And then we brought together a number of outside experts to guide us more closely in some efforts. And these did include folks who have expertise in team science, folks who have expertise in the international science domain, and obviously we drew on the literature as well. So I'm going to turn to a couple pieces in the literature that I think are valuable. And one is a study by Caroline Wagner, who was on our subcommittee and is a member of the advisory committee for NSF on science and engineering. And she and her colleague put out a really exciting study looking at the impact of science. And as you very well know, we often measure impact by whether or not a publication is highly cited, and so that is what was used here, versus the openness of the research environment. And so countries that have more scientists, more mobile, going in and out of their countries on shorter or longer research exchanges, produce papers that are more highly cited. So I've sort of don't have all of the countries represented here. I scaled it back to make it easier for you to see where the U.S. stands here. Point is, researcher mobility really matters. It matters at the individual researcher scale. It matters for the research collaboration. It actually matters for our national scientific enterprise. So I'll come back now to the survey that was done for Norwegian researchers, because I want to highlight the other thing that I think is really important, and that's that the mobility really matters for early career researchers. The same researchers who were surveyed to say what kinds of collaborations they worked in also were broken down by their academic rank. And so here you see that full professors in Norway are more likely to be involved in research groups and international networks, whereas assistant professors in Norway are more likely to be working alone or in formal groups, but less likely to be part of an international network. I don't think Norway will be an outlier. I think we could probably survey many countries and see this pattern. Point that I want to drive home is that mobility and the opportunity to be part of a large-scale collaboration is of great benefit to early career researchers. So those two pieces come together in the ExcelNet program, which I've already mentioned what it seeks to support by bringing U.S. and complementary research networks together to tackle grand scientific challenges. What we explicitly hope to have happen is that these linkages across networks will accelerate the progress of scientific discovery in that specific scientific grand challenge area, and that they will prepare U.S. postdocs, students, and early career researchers for conducting and leading these large-scale international collaborative efforts. So we outline in the solicitation explicit characteristics that we think those networks of networks should achieve, and obviously international engagement has to be integral to the success, cannot be an add-on, and that there must be alignment of the missions and goals across those networks, and they should be leveraging the resources of those various networks for mutual benefit. Because we're keen on seeing preparation of the next generation, there should be explicit professional skill development and a global research perspective included. And here's a last point that we want those networks of networks to have, that they should be developing protocols, activities, and products that are going to reduce the barrier to international collaboration. There are huge barriers to international collaboration beyond our cultural differences, and so we want the networks of networks that form to help solve some of those problems, not only for their own network of networks, but things that could be shared more broadly. So we offer opportunities both at a catalytic level and a larger scale. I'm not going to go into any detail there. I just want to highlight that. And that we want those efforts to have a vision and goal that obviously is going to drive the field forward. And we do make some specifications that it should be either a community-identified grand challenge, that there is consensus in the research area, that this is a large scientific problem that will require entities to come together to solve. Or an NSF big idea, and I won't go into that. It's available on the website. We can talk about it later. The point is we're sort of channeling proposers how to think about that scientific grand challenge. The other components I won't dive into because really much of the sessions later today pick up on pieces of these. What I want to highlight is that we do have clear expectations for how the projects can craft their network of networks to address some of those coordination and management issues, the role of the leadership, the role of the participants, and the activities that will allow those to function. The other thing I want to say, and it's another reason this workshop exists, is that any project at a network of network scale is going to have to require some intentional approaches and forethought to be successful. And again, I highlight the coordination management issue because there's no doubt that that one working at a network of network scale will require significant effort. I also highlight here that professional skill development for students, postdocs, and early career researchers is an area that will require significant intentional thought. You can't just throw a few students in an international collaboration and expect by osmosis they will later be able to lead one. So I highlight that component as well. Obviously, there are other areas that require intentionality, but for simplicity, I'm highlighting two that I think are that will either make or break projects. And then the last thing I want to do is let you know what's happening with the ExcelNet program. I said in 2017 we put out an initial call to the research community to tell us whether or not a program was needed. We have run the first competition and we are making the first awards now. Some are still yet to come out, but I have listed on the slide here those that are publicly available. We have funded projects both at the catalytic level and the full implementation scale. And I think, as was mentioned earlier today, we will be planning the first project meeting in October. We, again, rather intentionally chose to do that very early on in the award cycle so that we could bring these network of network leadership teams together to talk about common challenges they may see, their plans, so that they can share ideas and begin to build community. It will take a community of practice to collect the information about how networks of networks function so that we can then later share lessons learned at that scale. So I'll stop there and step away from the podium and turn it over to Carrie for some questions.
Thank you. Let me just get the mic going and we can.
Thank you for that presentation. That was great. I'm curious, is the idea of the network of networks to actually fund science, or is it more about funding networking?
Yep. So thank you for that question. It's a key one. As the ExcelNet program is really taking the research coordination network model and scaling it to networks of networks, we have taken with us the approach that we will not fund the science per se, we are funding the networking. We do have in the solicitation the option for projects to include research funds if they are targeting the students, postdocs, or early career researchers, and up to a certain percentage of the total budget. So we acknowledge that it's very hard to separate the research and the networking, but we target the research funds for those that we think will benefit most.
How about here and then?
So just a question here on cyber infrastructure. I think that Ariane had mentioned this earlier. And I think there is a lot of progress to be made in that area to develop cyber infrastructure tools to enhance the capacity of network for a network of networks. And so is there thinking about perhaps partnering with cyber infrastructure folks at NSF to create a larger pool of funds that can be drawn on to actually build those tools that actually increase capacity?
I'm getting my notebook out now to write down these good questions. The answer is we have not done that, and we do explicitly say in the program solicitation that it is not a program to build cyber infrastructure. We do anticipate that not only will there already be some established networks that can be linked, but those networks are drawing on cyber infrastructure that has been developed as those networks have been developed. But there is no doubt that there are additional cyber infrastructure needs, but we haven't partnered with the SESYNC Directorate to create an opportunity that would specifically address that.
Thank you. I have a couple of linked questions as I'm trying to wrap my head around the vision here. So coming back to the first question, if the bulk of the funding should be allocated not towards research activities, but towards more supporting the construction and maintenance of networks, then does the types of things that are likely to be competitive for funding, are those things like workshops, meetings, like what types so my first question is, what types of activities is ExcelNet most excited about seeing happen? And then related to that, a network of networks involves lots and lots and lots of entities, and the dollars don't trickle that far into the multiple layers of that. So I'm wondering, like, what ExcelNet is thinking about, how dollars can support things versus how leverage and goodwill and other relationships can continue to support good work happening. And then more from a bit of a nuts and bolts question, how senior do PIs have to be for a proposal to be competitive? I'm sorry, that's super nuts and boltsy. But then also I'm noticing up here that the ones successful last year are entirely universities. What is the role for boundary organizations?
So let me say, because most of these are collaborative proposals, we are including in this list the lead PI. If we included all of the entities, there was no way I could fit it on a slide. So do take that into consideration, that what you see is not the extent of the collaborative effort. There's no way it could be. But it is true that it is typical at NSF that the lead PI and lead institution is often an academic. The solicitation does not require that. So to be competitive, it would be need to simply be meritorious. There's no restriction. Let me see where I tackle. I think what I'll tackle first is the kinds of activities. And, you raise a really important question about the kinds of activities that we want to see. There are a bazillion workshops out there. So simply putting a proposal that adds another, several dozen workshops, that might be a known model, but it might not actually meet the needs of the network of networks. And so we encourage teams to think about what the network of network needs. We don't specify, because networks that come together are going to be at different stages of maturity. They're going to have different needs. And so the configuration of activities should meet the needs of that network of networks. But we do encourage, as NSF always does, innovative ideas, but also evidence-based ideas. So you want to choose activities that have a good rationale, but we don't specify. And the question about the funding, whether it's in-kind, collaboration, support, again, we do anticipate that these international networks of networks will have, in addition to the NSF funding, some goodwill that allows the effort to be carried out beyond our borders. There are some funds allocated for travel for international partners and scholar exchange and other sorts of critical activities for mobility and knowledge exchange to advance the frontiers. But as is typical at NSF, we do not explicitly fund research in international environments. And so in that case, we do the standard, we hope that the international researchers, if they are funding their research activities, have funding within their own countries. Not the best answer, but it's...
So I have a question regarding catalytic versus full scale. I know you covered this a little bit, but could you elaborate on that a little? I mean, is this primarily related to scale of funding, or is there scale of activities, or is there,
Yep.
are you expecting something different from a catalytic than you are a full?
Yeah, great question, thank you. So really, their rationale for setting these two levels was based not only the responses that we got from the community, from the Dear Colleague level letters, but also from the advice we got from our expert body that noted that there will be great needs at different levels. And so it makes sense to offer opportunities that are going to target the kinds of needs for less mature and more mature networks of networks. So catalytic level really should be at the earlier stages of figuring out once a scientific grand challenge is identified, how would the networks begin to align? What expertise would need to be brought together? How would the networks actually create the synergies? What are their contributions? So they're at much more of that planning level. We know we have something promising, but we don't have much in place. And so it's much more about those preliminary conversations about how would we align, what would we align, where can we advance the field. Whereas full-level projects should be at the stage that they've already got a sense of the landscape of the research problem and have already identified what knowledge gaps their new synergies could fill. So they've done that lay of the land work and are ready to say, here's where we see we can clearly advance the field. So they've got a much more concrete path forward.
I think that's a good segue into a question that I had based on something that you mentioned that I found striking. You did mention that the scope of research contribution matters. And the question that I have is if a big challenge, community-identified challenge, must be addressed, is there some conflict in between how broad that challenge would be and the specific research questions that the network would have to focus on? I think that a potential criticism on the part of reviewers may be that, yeah, the challenge may be big and community identified, but too broad.
Yeah, that's always a problem in research proposals, is the scope of the problem and the plan to address it. I would say that thinking about a network of network scales in which there should be a broad area of research that various research teams that are parts of networks can identify a wide array of kind of projects that would fill that knowledge gap. My personal opinion is that lay of the land should be clear, the kinds of problems that the teams could address should be clear. But if individual specific research projects are outlined at such a detailed level that somewhere there's a gap of scale, and by that I mean if each experiment is already outlined, you're probably tackling not a grand challenge, but an immediate challenge. And so I think that there needs to be a balance between identifying the broad problem, the approaches that would be taken, the kinds of methodologies that could be used to tackle it, and not researcher A will do experiment 1, researcher B will do experiment 2, because at a broad scale, you should be thinking big science, not small experiment. Those will, of course, happen, but they're not the scale that's needed for a network of networks proposal. Those would be the individual research projects.
Naturally, to achieve the vision that you just described in your last 2 sentences, there's a huge amount of facilitation that is required to come anywhere close to that, especially on an international scale. So I have 2 questions. What is the role of some sort of coordination, collaboration plan for those who would try to access this mechanism? And within the appropriations, are there dollars that can be dedicated to some sort of facilitation science that could help, drive, build, enhance, augment the, the collaborative strands that are already in place between these networks?
Okay, those are great questions. So I'll tackle first the role of the coordination collaboration. The solicitation does require that a collaboration plan is outlined, and that should describe roles and responsibilities of the leadership. It should describe how the organizational structure will be set up. And how communications might be handled, and who will have the task of doing a lot of that coordination. If there's a lot of scholar exchange and mobility, someone's booking a lot of travel. So back to the personnel question, that should be handled. And so it's absolutely fundamental that there are, within the structure of the project and in the funded portion of that, adequate attention and dollars to handle the coordination efforts. And collaboration, I think it's been brought up as well. How will data be shared? How will IP be shared? There are many issues beyond just the booking of travel that needs to be handled in the coordination effort. And so, yes, that has to be an integral part. And then your question about the facilitation, I think, is a great one. I had a little side conversation during the break about how the program and how projects could be thinking about the contribution to understanding of team science at the network of network scale. And really that is going to mean we need to be crossing our disciplinary borders in order to ensure that we are collaborating with the right entities so that the projects have that support and the program is in aggregate building that body of knowledge to contribute. So thank you.
So within the dimensions of biodiversity and the PIRE, there are identified partner nations for funding.
Yes.
Has that been established with this?
So great question. Last week we had a workshop on international partnerships because we knew at the outset that this question of how will international partners be funded. Now, granted, we provide some travel funds, but of course it can't cover absolutely everything. So we knew that there was a need that should be fulfilled. We also knew we couldn't wait until we solved that problem, that we needed to get the program out on the streets and learn what we could and then tackle that problem as we were at sort of the next iteration. I don't know how or when we'll really address the international partnership component, but we are tackling it.
Just a reminder for the live stream viewers that they can submit questions via the chat function on the YouTube page.
Oh, great. So just as a follow-up question to the international collaborations part, when we talk about grand challenges and things that we can't solve, we're often talking about, we're moving into that space of engaging scientists in the developing world. And I saw a few slides back, that these two parts was the network collaboration and then the learning dimension and the prioritization of skill development and at that early career level. And I just wonder to what it's so fantastic to get our researchers out in the world. What type of, I guess, how does SLNet also see having that learning alongside collaboration of international scholars, in the coming to the United States? Is that also prioritized? Because we can't kind of bring those other networks up to the level without that type of training. And you're going to continue to see Norway and the U.S. in the most highly cited area, and you're not going to see those papers coming from sub-Saharan Africa. And I'm just wondering, how does SLNet sort of see that dimension? And I realize it's challenging with international collaborations.
Yeah, it is. It is challenging, but the funds that the networks of networks can include for travel include U.S. students, researchers, postdocs, whomever, traveling abroad, and other students, postdocs, early career, full professor coming to the U.S. So the exchange can go any direction, and that learning together in community is critical, no matter what direction it's happening. The point is that people should be immersed in activities together, and ideally in more than one venue. So I'll just comment briefly that what often comes up is a question as well about capacity building. And we are very committed to ensuring that we're preparing the next generation of U.S. researchers to tackle these large international collaborative efforts. We hope always that, rising tide lifts all boats, that we are building capacity not only for our own researchers, but others. But as you would expect, this is not a development project, and so we aren't explicitly doing capacity building outside the U.S. And I know you expect that as an answer, but
No, that's good. Thank you for making that clear.
So in the case of a proposal submission where we are creating this international network of networks, how would we indicate within the submission, for example, if I've got an international network or somewhere, we'll say Chile, for example, and they are saying, look, if this gets funded, we will put forward this amount of money, or this agency will provide funds for us to do network of networks activities in this region, in this other country. How do we indicate that then in the proposal submission? Is that something we're permitted to indicate? Because I know in some cases that's not.
So we do encourage in the solicitation that within the body of the project description that the international collaborations and the contributions and the synergies and the resources that will be leveraged are all outlined. We also encourage within the facilities and resources section that the international partners' contributions and resources are outlined there. And so you can indeed use that section.
Okay.
So the section on evaluation says that's a good idea. Any more thoughts on what evaluation would look like?
So we ask that each project include an evaluation plan. We do not require that it is an external evaluation. It can be done internally by the network of networks. As a program, we have sat down with the NSF evaluation team to look at a program-wide evaluation. So like the knowledge development about networks of networks, we're also thinking about looking at that component from a programmatic level, not just a project level. But we do require that there are metrics of some sort, yes, and I'll take the pushback from projects that say we have to develop them as the project goes, but that's an approach. There must be a clear approach and a rationale for that.
If a team considering submitting a proposal were to have, say, another fairly large NSF funding effort in the form of a center or a traineeship, what have you, that is focused on that large challenge, community-identified challenge, would that be seen as a plus or as detrimental to AccelNet from NSF's standpoint? And what I mean is, would NSF say these guys are just trying to double dip? Or, oh no, that's a very good synergy. They're trying to bring together this effort that is already funded and projected abroad. How would that be perceived, do you think?
That's a good question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. I'm first going to start from the approach that by presenting you how NSF has funded collaborations and explicitly, how NSF has invested in building networks, I'm hinting we want people to leverage past investments. That there is no reason that a group should not mention we are building on past NSF funds and leveraging efforts. So that's an important component. Now, whether or not there's a current project that's funded that could have an appropriate complementary activity is a little bit different. You still would be leveraging funding, but we always require that any funded effort is distinct. So you would have to be very clear how an AccelNet project would do something above and beyond. Certainly it could leverage another effort, but it, of course, can't be duplicative. So you begin to do that fine line, and people do want to see that there is added value, that those extra funds would create something, do something beyond what has been done previously or is currently being done elsewhere. So being as explicit as you can with that is the key.
I wanted to ask, in addition to tackling a major scientific challenge, right? And in some developing countries, the value of publishing a paper, even getting IP, or is relative because there is not much they can get out of it, But then if you have a specific, tangible, actionable results, it's totally different because you get also even recognition from the community because you are showing actual results, right? So how important would it be in the proposal to also have some specific results that can be applicable in real implementations, basically, right? How do you measure the success in terms of publications and patents or IP, the typical scientific output versus real solutions, real implementations, real results? So.
That's a really great question because we want these large-scale efforts to drive the frontiers. Now, obviously, that has explicit in that language, it's about knowledge discovery. However, you can drive the frontier also by what's produced. And so I think that one is having an application and a results-oriented output is going to be valued without any doubt. But that would only be possible if you're driving the frontiers forward too. So.
Thank you very much, Claire. So I think we're going to be heading into lunch shortly, so we will just break now and be back here in at 1:30.